Yes, speed is what it's all about. And I guess over the last 2 days, we've talked about the speed of adoption in the digital space, and that's what I'm going to talk about today as well. I'd like to talk about a publisher's view, and we're going to be joined on video by a client of ours, a global client, Suresh Balaji from HSBC, who's part of the Global Media Group. And I'd also like to introduce you to some research which we've just conducted. And this is really to understand how consumers are moving. The big question which publishers like the BBC, media agencies represented in this room, and clients are all asking is, are we all going in the same direction? Or are we actually trying to achieve the same things? And quite frankly, do the economics work? Well, we'll see. We talk about audiences like it's a new thing. I was in television over 20 years ago, and we were talking about audiences quite a lot then. We talked about content as well, and we talked about programs. But whatever you talk about, creating content is an expensive hobby. So in terms of ROI, there's got to be ROI for those who create the content in the first place. But of course, for your clients, if you're a client or an agency, there's got to be ROI from those of you that you need to talk to, those audiences, through that content. So the question is, are the agendas of both groups converging or diverging? And we'll see. So what's happened a lot lately is that there are many people, and there are many more people in the game, trying to make a margin. Not sure that's necessarily a good thing, but it means that between publishers and audiences, the ecosystems have got a lot more complicated. And it makes it quite hard to track where value is and where value is being taken out of the system as you go through that journey. So we have to be very careful with this to understand where that value comes from. One truism we all know is that this business isn't very good about prediction. We're generally much slower than consumers. We were slower than consumers in the beginning of the digital age. We've been slower all the way through. And we resist change. You only have to look at the newspaper business to see how long they resisted before they realized that it was an unstoppable force that their consumers had already gone. And so we always tend to react in a very strange way. It's a bit like we look at an analogy, which is kids' football. Some of you may have children, age 5 to 7, and when they start playing football, they all kick the ball, and they all run after it in a big clump. They don't position themselves around the field. Now, I put it to you that as a business, we have been running after things as a big clump since the digital revolution. First, it was search. We all ran into the search corner. We ticked the digital box. We were doing search, and then came social. We all ran into that corner. And I have to say, I've talked to quite a few clients, both here in India as well as across Asia, who've given up their own websites to have a Facebook page instead. And a great many of them are regretting that move and actually reversing out of that. In the last 12 months, it's been much more about engagement and participation. And of course, the big buzzword for the future is either to be hyper-personal in the way that we target and the use of data, and also how we use technology in the RTB world and the exchange world. Is that another corner that we're all going to run into and expect to do everything for us? It's a dangerous way of running a media mix, from my perspective. So what is our perspective? We're going to go through 3 sections today. What do publishers think? What do advertisers think? And what is the audience doing anyway? And as far as we're concerned, it's all about engagement. In fact, we learned a lot of lessons last year. We were very fortunate to be the host broadcaster, as all of you know, for the Olympics. And the Olympics is a good indicator every 4 years to show you how the industry has moved on. And the big change between Beijing and London was that marketeers and media owners were much more interested in engagement than they were just about generating awareness. Awareness was not enough. The success of Coca-Cola or McDonald's was not necessarily about just getting awareness of their slogan, as it had been in Beijing. It was much more about delivering engagement and much more about the experience. And as such, we as a broadcaster became much more like you as marketeers. The things that we cared about in terms of the brief that we operated to, engage the audience across multiple media, were very similar to the brief that the sponsors were focusing on at the same time. It was all about the audiences, and it was all about being given choice, being agnostic to device and giving them control. In fact, we went through this in a very unusual way. We created 26 digital channels, and some of those channels were big enough to be channels in their own right. But frankly, we were not held back in the UK by a business model. Some of you may or may not know, the BBC is a public service broadcast in the UK, not driven by the street. So we could be completely agnostic to the way audiences wanted to engage with us, without worrying about where the economics were in terms of ROI. And what we started to see was record television numbers by even bigger digital numbers. And all we thought was, well, that's good. We put the Olympics in front of the audience in a way that they wanted to receive it. We've given them interaction. We've given them engagement. And as such, it meant that more screens we were able to engage, the better it was for the audience. And the conclusion was very simple. We've got our definitions all wrong. We've talked about desktop. We've talked about mobile. We're still talking about TV. What's the difference? It's just screens. And as you'll see in a little while, that's what the audiences think too. But unfortunately, we've also delineated those definitions around the ways in which we think about the relative value of each of them. The value of those screens is an issue. It's a very big issue for content producers. It's a very big issue for advertisers. And if you don't start to address that, we've got a problem. So we wanted to talk about value. And how do we talk about value? Well, this is how we think about everything that you can do and everything we can do. Looking at this chart, you'll see the highest value in terms of ROI is on the top. Branded content, where a media brand is linked with a client's brand, and where we enter into a marketing partnership, not a media partnership, where we're dealing at a board level, and we worry about board metrics for a company. Not surprisingly, the marriage between context and content and data is the next most valuable asset as you go down that chart. And if you go down the list, you get to a point where you don't see the value of the audiences on their own without context as being so high. But the other thing you should notice on this chart is that there's a cost differential. The ROI in terms of value has got to be higher at the top in order to make that investment pay off, literally returning on that investment. The danger is that we all think that some part of this can do the job of other parts. We go back to the kids' football issue. Will it be all technology-driven? Will we only care about audiences? Or will context not have such an important role? We don't think so, and we don't think consumers think so. But that is very useful for us in terms of understanding where we are in a continuum and where we're getting our value from. So that's our view in terms of how we think about value. But actually, what does an advertiser think? And the more and more, as you've heard over the past 2 days, marketers are thinking about how do I link my marketing objectives to my media metrics? And am I measured on click-throughs or GRPs? Am I measured on something else? I've got to link those objectives of the business back to how the investment of media is driving those objectives. And sometimes that gets lost in translation between us as media owners and media agencies who fall into the trap of dealing in media metrics as a success metric, but not really thinking about how it translates as far as the client is concerned. But I'm not going to do the talking. I want to allow Suresh Balaji, whom I talked earlier about, from HSBC, who's very involved in media innovation for HSBC on a global basis, to talk to you. And we asked him a few questions. The first question we asked him was around planning and buying. We basically said, is it easier or harder from a client's perspective? And is there a sort of mantra behind the HSBC's philosophy of how they think about media? And let's see what Suresh said to answer that question. Senthil?
New world, business objectives and media planning are new best friends. All businesses, by definition, are economic entities, and every action that the marketer does needs to have some connection to the P&L. Media planning is getting harder because if you're unable to bring hard connections to the P&L, it'll be very difficult to justify media planning. On one hand, when media planning is becoming harder because of fragmented consumer behavior, fragmented media behavior, multi-screen, multi-platform, yada yada, and all that stuff, the most important thing is to bring a lot of rigor to help connect the media plan to a P&L level discussion. And I think that is what is getting harder. I'm quite a big fan of Chris's value pyramid, to be honest. It tells me one thing, and it tells me one thing really clearly. It's horses for courses. So if you look at the entire value pyramid, and big complex organizations like ours, or big complex organizations which have multiple products, multiple services, multiple customer bases, these organizations will have to play across the value chain, across the pyramid to use this context here. Businesses like telcos, businesses like big supermarket chains, they will need to build brands as well as get people through the door through their promotions and for their day-to-day sales. So the question that one needs to have is, when planning a campaign or planning the annual activity, have a look at what are the objectives, how do we commercialize some of those marketing plans, and what's the place where we want to start having a conversation with. If we have a very clear understanding of it's a brand level conversation, then it's a very different brief, it's a very different set of publishers. But if we know it's a buy one, get one free, then it's a very different conversation, then it's very different horses for that course.
The second question we asked him was, what does he feel about automation? And how does he feel about new models of measurement? And how does that fit into the HSBC view of the world? So let's hear what he has to say.
Technology is changing everything that we do nowadays. I think technology is the all-pervasive, omnipresent thing that everyone's talking about. Technology needs to change the way we look at media planning and media building, and I'm a big fan of technology. But there's a big risk of things like RTB being missold. Marketers are under tremendous pressure to stretch the dollar, and when they're under tremendous pressure to find return on investment vehicles and to cut costs, things like RTB land up becoming a quick panacea for all evils. But I think we need to go back to the value pyramid, and the question is, where does RTB fit for what kind of activity and what kind of objectives? If your objectives are about impressions, if your objectives are about carpet bombing, mass conversations, that's a different story. Then RTB probably is great there. But if your conversation is about context and long-term brand building, I think one needs to figure out how to move up the value chain. I think it truly matters where the audience is. It depends on where your brand is, and it depends on where you want your brand to be seen. I think the conversations are starting to become complex because we look at the digital world, and the context in the digital world is changing by the day. There are a lot many more places where you could see your brand, and in this complex environment, marketers really don't know who to trust and when to trust someone when they say this is the right place for your brand. I think the conversation needs to be about the core of the brand, what the brand's essence is, and how the context can actually help enhance the brand's value. So I go back to objectives. If the conversation is around enhancing brand value, and the conversation needs to be always around where do you want to see your brand. If the conversation is around quick returns, and you're not really worried about long-term impact quick returns will have on your brand value, then context may not be important. So I think audience data and context are two sides of the same coin, but one needs to figure out what the other side is before you take decisions on one side. Measurement models are getting increasingly complex. In today's world, we see dashboards for everything. There are multi-layered dashboards, data coming from post-click analysis, from our own websites, transactional banking dashboards from call centers. The most important question to ask is, what measurements will help you look at things that you did in the past to enhance things that you can do in the future? What measurements can actually help decision-making from a marketing communication standpoint, from a marketing standpoint, and from a business objective standpoint? One needs to figure out what are those top-line measures that we need to see as marketers, and what measures do our media partners need to see and our media agencies need to see. And there needs to be a clear demarcation of measures that help drive future value. And the final question was obviously, what would you like to hear from the industry?
What questions are burning from your point of view? So let's see what he had to say to that.
I've had lots of publishers and agencies speaking to me about the latest trends. There's always a new trend. There's always somebody knocking on your door saying, here is a bag full of new tricks. My big request would be to help marketers commercialize marketing. I think the conversation needs to start at where is value created? And I think advertisers and media agencies need to be part of this conversation. There is no marketer who's going to say no to a proposal that comes through that's going to help him in his objectives. Marketers find it really difficult to have conversations around, here is the latest trend, here is a great deal. That's a very difficult conversation to have. That's a difficult piece to sell. The easier thing is to go and say, here are your objectives and here is how we will help achieve them. I think we need to get together and have this conversation. Media owners and agencies have a better view of the world than we do. Marketers spend most of their time negotiating internally, negotiating budgets, negotiating marketing plans, negotiating business agendas. And what we need is somebody to help us with the wider view of the world. Many media owners, so probably sitting in the room, are global media owners. They have access to global understanding, global research reports, understanding of how things can be done better. We look to you and we look to media agencies to come and tell us, here is what we can learn from one part of the world that you can apply in yours. Here is how some things that somebody has tried and tested can actually help you do your business better. We look for knowledge exchange. We look for value creation at a much more higher level. What we definitely don't look for is, here is a great deal.
That's a great brief from a global client, HSBC. So we've heard what publishers think, we've heard what the client thinks, but actually none of that really matters because the reality is, what do consumers think? Where do they see the value as they move forward with their smartphones, their pads, their desktops, their smart TVs, and all the other devices around them? Where do they see the best place for content? And the question I have for us as an industry is, shouldn't we reflect where they see the value in the way where we see the value? Because I think you'll see in a minute, we certainly don't do that today. We need to reset our heads around the consumer journey. And there's a good illustration of it. If you look at that chart, in that thing we call mobile, we have massively undervalued it as a medium. We started with ad networks. We piled it all in. And as you know, the differential in price between desktop and mobile is colossal. Bit of a worry for us, and I'm sure for some of you as well. In about a year's time, BBC.com's traffic will be about 50% on mobile by the end of next year. And if we don't address this, we don't have a business. It's as simple as that. And what's really interesting is that the consumers have made that journey. In this part of the world, a lot of them are going straight to the smart device. I'm not going to call it mobile anymore, as it's the wrong definition. But very soon, that will become the rule. But they obviously see a lot more value than we as an industry do. So we felt that it was important for us to understand our platform strategy, to actually understand what consumers thought in a lot more detail. And we went out and commissioned a piece of consumer research with a pretty big sample. Over 3,600 people across 9 countries, the US, Europe, Africa, Asia, including India. So a very good cross-section of the audience. And we're using it as we planned rollout of our content across multiple screens, but we're also able to use it to understand the role of advertising from a consumer's perspective in this space. And the first thing isn't surprising. If you look at the chart, and you remember, this is about news consumption, the first thing we saw through the results of this survey is that it's not about a device you use at a time of day. It's about the emphasis. Consumers are using all the devices, all the time, but at different times of the day. In their need state, they tend to use one more than the others. So they're not sort of switching neatly between a tablet to TV, depending on whether it's lunch or afternoon or evening. They're multitasking across all these elements. And so if you're thinking about media, you've got to think about how media crosses all those boundaries of screens rather than looking at it in a compartmentalized way. We also took this opportunity to ask what is quite an unusual question in research, very overtly asking them about advertising. We asked them, where did they expect to see advertising? Where do they feel comfortable seeing advertising? And how much do they feel comfortable with? And the whole aspect of whether that drives engagement or whether that drives engagement away. Whatever effect, it had to be that we were very keen to find out. And the first result, when they were asked that question, they were very evenly spread in terms of where they expect to see advertising. They're expecting to see it as much on desktops and mobiles, as we call them, and pads and TV. They think of these things as screens, and actually, they're quite happy to think about advertising across all of them. And then we looked at how they consume across all the devices and asked them the unusual question. We actually asked them to be a media planner. We said, where would you weight the advertising you expect to see? And what's interesting here is that they prove the TV is alive and kicking and doing very well. But look how much they've weighted where they expect to see advertising in tablets and mobiles. If I take a moment here, I'm not sure how many of you are putting 29% of your media budget on tablets and mobiles. But according to this, you should be thinking about a media mix, which is somewhat different. I guess my issue and our issue is that if I encourage you to do that, we'll be out of business because it's a dollar-cents equation at the moment. The consumers are not thinking about it that way. They're thinking about it as just another screen. And you can think of it as just another screen because according to this piece of research, their engagement levels are just as high depending which screen it is. There's equal value across TVs, laptops, and mobiles. And if you must talk about response, as I know that's something which we all focus on, we asked them about that too. And once again, you can see they're engaging with content and advertising in a more equal way than you might have given it credit for. Ultimately then, what this research tells us is that if you're planning media across multiple screens, the relative price of this should also be much closer. And then you can truly accept how consumers are agnostic to screen and how they're consuming content in a way that we're not giving them credit for as media planners and media owners. So what do we conclude? As I've said, if you think of consumers and the way that they engage with content, that's got to be the way we think about the value of advertising messages within this space. Therefore, audiences are key. It's the only thing we care about when you have to have content to generate those audiences. People still watch TV programs. They will watch TV programs forever. Social has a place in our world, but people still watch shows. People are still tuning into cricket. There are certain things that you need to do as a group live, which is probably not just served in a similar fashion in any other way. So I put it to you today that we've got to throw away the definitions that are biasing the way that we think about media. And if you look at the slide, in reality, there's no difference. The only difference in this picture is that the second screen is 3 meters away, and the first screen is half a meter away. The resolution is the same. You could argue that if one is linear television and one is video on demand, the consumer who's actively engaged in that mobile device to watch a movie is far more engaged to your advertising message than the person on linear TV who gets it watching over them. You could argue that targeting big data on the small screen is much bigger than the larger screen. And I would argue, as somebody who's been in television for a very long time, I don't remember a media plan where somebody said, I'm going to pay less for a portable TV than I am for a bigger one. And I guess that's the only difference. And we've really got to reset the way we think about this. So I've said my appeal to you as a publisher is that we can't afford to undervalue the screens. We're not going to call them mobile or desktop or TV anymore. They're just screens. But we owe it to you, particularly as marketeers, but also as agency media buyers and planners, to make it much simpler. If you want to buy across multiple screens at the moment, you often have to do a different piece of creative, 1 pixel different. That's quite a hassle. We need to make it easy where one size fits all through responsive design. And doing that as an industry is literally easier than placing one ad across every screen. It is easier to drive brand metrics. It's also easier to use data. But we have to extract the value in the way that it is more equal. And ultimately, I want to bring you back to this value gauge, because all the elements, as Suresh said, have a part in the media mix, depending on which business you're driving and what your overall objective is. The danger, as in the kids' football analogy, is that we think of some of them that can do the job of others. We believe that automation of media can do everything. But we don't think it can. And whilst there's often a desire to capture audiences to add value to them out of context, where they were originally generated, that, in the long term, destroys the original generation of those content and those audiences. It just won't work as a long-term strategy. Somebody will make the money in the short term, but ultimately, it will not allow the economies of our business to exist. So my appeal to you is to look at the relative value. Give it the right value that is allied to how consumers think of it, not how we as an industry think of it. And in so doing, the move to 50% on static devices will not become an issue. It'll be something to embrace. It won't be a business killer. But unfortunately, the way we are behaving at the moment, there is a danger that we could cause that sort of catastrophe. Thank you very much.